Hey guys, thank you so much for clicking on this video before you head off to sleep. Tonight, I have something really special for you, a gentle retelling of one of the oldest and most legendary tales in human history, the Trojan War. But don't worry, this isn't a noisy or action-packed version. This is a soft, dreamy journey through time, myth, and memory. You'll meet gods and heroes, hear whispers of fate, and travel through golden halls and smoky battlegrounds, all in a way that's soothing, calming, and perfect for drifting off. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, it would mean the world to me if you take just a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another sleepy myth or fairy tale adventure. I truly hope this story brings you peace tonight and helps you fall into a deep, restful sleep. Now, take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, and let's begin our journey into the Whispering Age, where the seeds of destiny were first planted and the embers of war were still silent. Long ago, when the world was younger and the stars burned brighter above the Aegean Sea, there was a stillness that blanketed the lands like soft wool. The kingdoms of men had not yet roared to their greatest heights, and the gods upon Mount Olympus still whispered closely to the mortals below. The wind carried no scent of war, only the hush of olive groves and the laughter of distant herdsmen in golden fields. It was the age before rage, before pride, before glory. It was an age of gentle whispers, where every story began slowly, as if the earth itself exhaled it into being. In a valley bathed in dawn's first shimmer, the kingdom of Troy stood like a jewel upon the sea. Its walls, built by the hands of gods, shimmered pale and proud beneath the touch of morning. Within its gates, peace hummed softly, a quiet hum that lived in the rhythm of craftsmen at their workbenches, in the footsteps of sandalwood-inlaid corridors, and in the songs of nurses cradling infants born under tranquil stars. King Priam, ruler of Troy, was already growing old, his beard now streaked with the silver of wisdom. He was a thoughtful king, known more for his patience than his might. He ruled beside Queen Hecuba, whose eyes, though weary, still held the light of fierce protection. Their household was grand and growing. Sons and daughters, strong, noble, gifted, ran through the palace gardens like sunlight spilled across marble. Among them was the crown prince, Hector, proud and silent, and his younger brother, Paris, whose beauty was whispered of in every port. But Paris was not like the others. He had not been born into the golden halls of Troy, but had grown among shepherds. Left on a mountainside, at birth, after a dream, warned Queen Hecuba of a flame that would consume the city. The child was spared by fate, raised with lambs and wildflowers, knowing nothing of the prophecy tied to his name. It was not until he was nearly a man that the truth reached him, that he was royal born, that his blood was tied to the very heart of Troy. And so he returned, uncertain, with mountain air still clinging to his voice. But in those early days, the city welcomed him. Priam embraced him not as a threat, but as a son returned from shadow. Hecuba wept into his curls, and the people of Troy, in their peace, did not yet imagine what price would one day be paid for that kindness. Far away, across the sea, where the sun dipped into wine-dark waves, stood Sparta, ruled by King Menelaus, a proud man, though younger than his brother Agamemnon, king of the great Mycenae. The Spartan court was one of stone and discipline, yet even there, warmth existed in the shape of Queen Helen, she of the swan's grace and starlit hair. They said the gods had shaped her. They said She could bring silence to a crowded hall with a glance. And yet, as the bards would one day sing, beauty such as hers is never left to rest. One day, though no storm yet brewed, no sword yet sang, the gods began to whisper. On Mount Olympus, where clouds curled around marble and ambrosia perfumed the air, a single golden apple was tossed upon the feast table of immortals. To the fairest, it read, in letters that shimmered like dew. It was a simple thing, really, a prank of the goddess Eris, left out of the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, a godless mischief for a godly audience. But gods do not forget slights, nor do they share glory. And so, three goddesses laid claim to the apple: Hera, queen of the gods, regal and commanding; Athena, the warrior of wisdom, proud and unyielding; and Aphrodite, soft-spoken and secret-smiled, goddess of desire. None would yield, none would blink, and none could judge themselves. So Zeus, weary of divine rivalries, passed the burden onto a mortal. And who better than Paris, son of Priam, shepherd prince of Troy? Thus, the stage began to build, quietly, with brushstrokes of fate barely visible to the human eye. A boy on a hill, a golden apple, a choice that would one day crack the world like thunder, but began in silence, as all storms do. Paris stood among the oaks when the goddesses came to him, cloaked in golden mist. The sheep stirred, the sun held its breath, and the three stood tall before him, their beauty almost unbearable in its clarity. Each offered a gift. Hera promised dominion, the rule of great kingdoms, power beyond his imagining. Athena offered wisdom and glory in war, the kind of fame that etches itself into time. But Aphrodite smiled gently and whispered of love. She promised him the heart of the most beautiful woman on earth. And so Paris, who had never known his mother's lullabies, nor the comfort of a name spoken nightly in love, chose the goddess who spoke of belonging. He handed her the apple, and thus the whisper became a wind. Across the sea, Helen dreamed that night of a stranger with sunlight in his eyes. And in the quiet halls of Troy, the box of fate creaked open. When Paris awoke the morning after the goddesses had visited him, the dew still clung to the hillsides, and the sky shimmered like a silken veil stretched across the heavens. The sheep moved gently among the grass, undisturbed by the presence of the divine. And yet, something in the wind had changed, not in sharpness or speed, but in direction. The world, it seemed, had shifted ever so slightly beneath his feet. He had made a choice. He had handed the golden apple to Aphrodite, and in that gesture, the future had begun to stir, slowly but surely, like a great beast turning in its sleep. The goddess, true to her word, did not linger. She vanished into the light, leaving only the faint scent of rosewater on the breeze, and a whisper that lingered in Paris's chest like the final note of a lullaby. He did not know where or when he would meet this Helen she had promised. He only knew now that his fate was no longer his own. And yet, in his heart, there was no fear, only wonder. It was not long after that Paris was called back to Troy by Priam himself. The old king, with his heavy crown and patient voice, had felt something stirring in the threads of time. Dreams troubled the queen. Birds circled strangely over the palace. And Paris, the son who had been lost, was summoned home as if destiny had simply remembered him. He returned to the city, not as a boy of the mountains, but as a prince, robed in soft linens, with the memory of oaks in his gaze. Hector embraced him first, the warrior brother, with shoulders like carved stone and eyes dark as the sea during storms. The other brothers and sisters welcomed him too, some with warm hands, some with wary glances, as though sensing a spark too close to dry wheat. But Paris, though quieter than most, was not cruel. He moved through Troy like a song long forgotten, gentle, elegant, almost wistful. The people whispered of his beauty, of the strange grace he carried, and the city, still cradled in peace, made room for him. Yet across the sea, in the kingdom of Sparta, a different wind began to stir. Helen, queen of the White Islands, sat on the marble steps of her palace and felt the chill of something unseen brush her skin. Her days were filled with duty, walking beside King Menelaus through stone courtyards, speaking to emissaries, holding the hand of her daughter Hermione, who loved birds and asked why the stars moved. But Helen's thoughts were distant. At night, she dreamed of meadows she had never walked, of voices that called her name in a tongue she could not place. She dreamed of a young man with sunlight in his eyes and the scent of olive leaves clinging to his skin. She did not know Paris, not yet. And yet the dream returned, night after night, like a tide that refused to retreat. One season faded into another, and with it came the festival of friendship, where the Greek kingdoms exchanged gifts and guests, where wine flowed and stories were traded like jewels. It was during this time that Paris was chosen as Troy's emissary to Sparta, a diplomatic visit meant to strengthen bonds, to shake hands across seas. Priam, perhaps, did not fully know why he agreed to send Paris. Perhaps he believed it was time his son knew the world. Or perhaps, in some corner of his heart, he had begun to sense the whisper that followed Paris like a shadow. Soft, insistent, inevitable. And so Paris sailed across the wine-dark sea. The ship was simple, its sails catching the wind like wings. Paris stood at its helm, one hand resting lightly on the wooden rail, the other curled around a pouch Aphrodite had given him. Nothing more than a sprig of myrtle and a folded ribbon, but they burned warm in his palm. When they reached Sparta, the skies were gold with late summer, and the city gleamed like a polished blade. Menelaus welcomed the delegation with all the ceremony expected of a king. There were banquets and chariot races, offerings to the gods, and music that lingered through courtyards deep into the night. And then Paris saw her, Helen. She walked through the palace gardens as though the air parted for her passage. Her gown whispered against the stone. Her hair flowed like dark honey, and in her eyes was a sadness so quiet it felt like music left unfinished. When their gazes met, the world hushed. Not because of magic, nor command, but because sometimes the threads of fate draw too tight, and the air forgets how to move. Aphrodite's promise bloomed between them in silence. Helen smiled, not with surprise, not even with curiosity, but with the quiet knowing of one who has seen the shape of her future in the reflection of a dream. And Paris, though he said nothing, felt his heart beat slow, like waves settling under moonlight. The days that followed passed like mist, slow, luminous, ungraspable. Paris and Helen walked in gardens, speaking softly of art and memory. They shared stories under olive trees. They laughed at nothing, and sometimes they said nothing at all. It was not a courtship of haste or fire. It was a falling, gentle, inevitable, like autumn leaves slipping from branches. Menelaus, ever the dutiful king, received word from Crete, matters of trade, a dying cousin, a funeral, and prepared to leave temporarily, trusting Helen to host their guests with the grace she had always shown. And in the hush that followed his departure, the moment arrived. not with thunder, not with swords drawn or doors slammed, but with a boat waiting quietly by the shore, and two figures cloaked in night, carrying only their names and the weight of an ancient apple. Night in Sparta was a soft affair. Unlike the burning festivals of other kingdoms, or the warlike drums of Mycenae, Sparta slept with discipline, a silence that blanketed the courtyards and calmed even the crickets into stillness. The torches flickered low, casting long shadows against marble walls. The sky above stretched wide and deep, scattered with stars like silver dust drifting upon velvet. By the garden wall, beneath the vine-draped arches where Helen once tended lavender with her daughter, Paris waited. He wore no armor, only a long traveler's cloak, drawn close against the sea breeze. In his hand, he held not a sword, but a ribbon, soft, crimson, the same one Aphrodite had given him. He turned it slowly between his fingers, over and over, as if it were the thread of fate itself. Helen came without a sound. Her white robes glowed faintly in the starlight. Her golden hair was braided simply, tucked beneath a shawl. She did not tremble. Her eyes, when they met his, held only stillness, the kind that comes after a long breath, the kind that lives between the beats of a heart that already knows its direction. They said no words. There was nothing left to explain. The path they had chosen was quiet, lined not with roses, but with consequence. And yet, neither turned back. A boat waited at the shore, a small vessel, barely more than a shadow against the water, its sails furled, its oars silent. A few trusted sailors, sworn to Troy, bowed their heads as the couple approached. No horns were blown, no flames were lit, only the hush of sea foam on sand, and the distant cry of an owl as it circled above. Helen paused just once before boarding. She looked back toward the palace. She saw the tower where Hermione slept, a child still curled in dreams of birds and flowers. She saw the columns where Menelaus had once held her hand, and she saw the garden where nothing had ever truly bloomed, despite how carefully it had been tended. When she turned away, it was not with haste, only with finality. The boat glided into the open sea, cutting through waves like a whisper through silk. Paris stood at the bow, watching the stars. Helen sat behind him, fingers laced together in her lap, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, not of comfort, but of inevitability. The wind carried the scent of salt and wild thyme, and above them the gods watched in silence. On Mount Olympus, Aphrodite smiled. Hera scowled. Athena looked down, thoughtful. They knew, all of them, what would follow. The years of blood, the burning towers, the sorrow of kings and the cries of fallen heroes. But gods are not moved by mortal fear. They are moved by balance, by pride, and by the echo of their own wagers. And so, the journey continued. The voyage to Troy was not swift. The Aegean could be calm or cruel, and the seas between Sparta and the Trojan shores were filled with islands and winds that often argued with one another. But for Paris and Helen, the days passed not in worry, but in stillness. They sat together on deck, sharing pieces of fruit, watching the horizon. They spoke softly, of childhood memories, of songs half remembered, of stars neither had names for. It was not a romance of fire and urgency, but of reflection. Two souls adrift in the space between decision and consequence. Each night, Helen traced the constellations, telling stories her mother once told her. And Paris, who had grown up under the sky of shepherds, added his own. Tales of wolves and dreams, of trees that spoke in sleep. They wove together a tapestry of myth, unaware that they themselves were becoming one. And still, the sea carried them forward. When at last the towers of Troy rose in the distance, pale spires gleaming beneath the sunrise, neither of them spoke. The city looked peaceful from afar, a citadel carved from stone and sky. Smoke curled from the hearths, birds circled the temples, and the gate, massive and ancient, stood open to receive them. Word had traveled ahead. Priam, king of Troy, stood upon the steps of the palace with Queen Hecuba and Hector beside him. The nobles of the court whispered among themselves, their eyes shifting between curiosity and alarm. No missive had been sent from Sparta. No alliance had been proposed. And yet, Paris returned. With Helen, the queen whose name was sung in every corner of the world. Hector stepped forward first, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. Paris dismounted from the chariot with care, offering his hand to Helen, who stepped down slowly. She bowed her head, not in shame, but in respect, to the land, to the king, to the future that now pressed its weight upon her shoulders. For a moment, no one spoke. And then Priam, old and weathered, with a voice like distant thunder, said softly, "You bring not just beauty, my son, but storms." And Paris, steady as ever, answered, "Storms come whether we call them or not, father. I have only followed the wind." That night, there was no celebration, no feasting, no music, only silence. The deep, expectant silence that settles over a city just before the first cloud darkens the sun. And in that hush, the people of Troy began to dream strange dreams. The sun had not yet risen when the first murmur reached the shores of Mycenae. It arrived not with trumpets or blood-stained scrolls, but with the quiet tread of a messenger, soaked in brine, voice trembling with urgency. He carried no banners. He bore no offerings. Only words, soft, terrible words that would set the world afire. Paris of Troy has taken Queen Helen from Sparta. It echoed through the halls of Agamemnon like a curse. The king, ruler of vast Mycenae and brother to Menelaus, stood still for a long moment after hearing it. His brow, carved deep from war and worry, furrowed further. The air in the hall thickened. Not because of outrage, not yet, but because a piece of the great game had just been moved, and he, always the strategist, had waited for a reason. Helen's abduction was that reason. Menelaus, upon his return to Sparta and the empty chambers of his queen, had torn his garments and wept as a man betrayed not only in love, but in honor. But it was to his brother he turned for retribution, and Agamemnon, already dreaming of conquest, answered not with sympathy, but with summoning. He sent riders to every corner of Greece, to Ithaca, where clever Odysseus rocked his infant son to sleep, to Pylos, where wise Nestor stood among scrolls, to Phthia, where Achilles, barely a man, trained beneath the gaze of the centaur Chiron. One by one, oaths were called upon. Blood pacts were remembered. Ancient promises, once made under stars and mead, were dusted off and sharpened like blades. Helen was more than a queen now. She was a symbol, a pretext. And like moths to flame, kings and warriors answered the call, not always out of loyalty, but often out of pride or ambition, or the faint hope that their names might echo beyond their bones. Across the Aegean, the Trojan court was shifting too. Helen sat in the palace of Ilium, wrapped in soft robes, but the weight on her shoulders grew heavier by the hour. She walked among flowered courtyards and golden halls, and though no one spoke cruelty to her face, she felt the glances, some with wonder, others with blame. Hector, who loved his brother but loved his city more, began sharpening his sword again, and Priam, old and tired, lit candles in the temple of Apollo, praying not for peace, but for clarity. For all its beauty, Troy was not built on naivety. It was a city of marble and myths, of warriors and scholars, and it had seen omens before. Now, dreams of fire returned to the people. Women awoke weeping from visions of ships blotting out the sea. Children whispered of black birds gathering on the towers, and priests saw symbols in the entrails of oxen they could not explain. Only Cassandra, the cursed prophetess, screamed truth into the wind. "They are coming! They are coming!" But no one believed her. Her words, true as they were, had long been twisted by Apollo's spite. She saw too clearly, and for that was doomed never to be trusted. In the weeks that followed, Paris walked through the streets as if trying to remember how to breathe. He smiled for Helen when she needed him to. He spoke to the elders when required. But the stillness he once carried, that dreamy quiet of a shepherd under stars, had begun to fray. He was not cruel. He did not revel in the storm he had summoned, but neither did he regret it. And that, perhaps, was the heaviest part of all. On the cliffside above Troy, where wild lavender grew in patches and the wind ran unchecked, Paris met Aphrodite one final time. She came in the form of a woman cloaked in light, her hair the color of dusk, her eyes wide and infinite. She did not smile this time. "You have what you asked for," she said, touching the ribbon at his wrist. "But love, like fire, does not burn alone." Paris bowed his head. "Will she suffer?" he asked, the wind pulling at his words. Aphrodite tilted her head gently. "Yes, but so will you. So will they all." She stepped away, the breeze lifting her gown like smoke. "You have lit a flame. It will warm. It will destroy. That is its nature." And with that, she vanished into the air. Paris stood for a long time beneath the open sky, the sea below dark and endless. He listened to the distant hum of the city, the faint clang of forge hammers as armor was repaired, the whispers of his name slipping between rooftops like the wind itself could not forget him. He had chosen love, but fate, ancient and patient, had chosen war. Far across the wine-dark sea, where cliffs bared their teeth to the waves and pine trees bent to salt-laced winds, the port of Aulis slowly awakened to the sounds of change. At first, there were only a few ships, dark, wide-bellied crafts carved from cypress and oak, lashed with sinew and hope. They came with the tide, bobbing gently like gulls. Their sails rolled tight against their masts. But soon, the bay grew crowded. The horizon began to fill with vessels of all shapes and banners, each one flying a different symbol, a different pride. From every corner of Greece, warriors came. It was not just loyalty that summoned them, though many swore oaths at the fireside. It was the weight of legacy, the lure of renown, the belief, deeply rooted, that their names might one day live beyond the dust of their bones. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, stood high upon a stone rise overlooking the growing fleet. His armor gleamed like lion's gold. His crimson cloak fluttered in the sea wind. There was no joy in his face, only the calm of a man who had decided long ago that history must remember him, whether in glory or ash. Beside him stood Menelaus, whose grief had hardened into something colder than steel. His wife was not merely gone. She had been taken, stolen beneath his roof while his guard slept. And though Helen's smile once made poets sing, now it haunted him like a shadow. Not love, but justice burned in his gaze. The ships come, Menelaus murmured. Agamemnon nodded. And more will follow. They always do. The scent of war carries far. Indeed, they came. From Ithaca arrived Odysseus, clever-eyed, slow to anger, slower still to trust. He had tried to remain behind, feigning madness by plowing his fields with salt. But the summons was a net cast too wide. When messengers placed his infant son before the plow's path, Odysseus turned aside, sighing. Even the cunning could not slip through fate's fingers forever. From Phthia rode Achilles, still young, still burning. His mother, Thetis of the sea, had bathed him in the river Styx, making his skin near invulnerable, save for one small place on his heel where her fingers had held him. He came not for Helen, but for the chance to be remembered, for songs sung in firelight long after his bones were gone. Diomedes of Argos, Ajax of Salamis, Nestor of Pylos, gray-bearded and wise, all arrived. Great kings and lesser lords, archers, smiths, horsemen. Some brought whole armies, others only themselves and a spear. The beach at Aulis became a city of canvas and clamor. Tents rose like mushrooms in spring. Fires crackled with fresh kills. Blacksmiths clanged iron against anvils from dawn until dusk. The air, once clean with salt, now smelled of sweat, leather, and waiting. Still, the ships did not sail. Days passed, then weeks. The wind, so constant before, refused to rise. The sails hung limp. The oarsmen grew restless, and as the days burned longer, whispers began to slither like smoke between the tents. Some said the gods were displeased. Others said the gods were waiting for something, for someone. One morning, a priest named Calchas stepped forward. His robes whipped in a breeze, too weak to carry a feather. His voice cracked as he spoke before Agamemnon and the assembled captains. "I have dreamed," he said, "and the dreams have teeth." The crowd leaned in. "Artemis is angry," Calchas continued, "the goddess of the wild, of the hunt, of balance. A deer, sacred to her, was slain by your hunters, and now she holds the winds in her palm. She will not let them go unless—" He paused. "Unless what?" growled Menelaus. Calchas looked not at him, but at Agamemnon. "She demands a price," the priest whispered. "Your daughter, Iphigenia." A hush fell, deeper than before. Even the gulls overhead went silent. Agamemnon did not speak. Not at first. His jaw clenched. His eyes searched the sky as if hoping it might offer a better answer. But the sky remained cloudless. The ships remained still. And the soldiers, though they did not speak it, began to murmur of turning home. That night, Agamemnon sat alone in his tent. A single oil lamp burned low. He held a letter in his hand, an invitation to his wife, Clytemnestra, in Mycenae. A lie, sweetly worded. A pretense that Achilles would marry their daughter at Aulis, a joyous union before war. But the truth curled behind it, dark and bitter. He signed it with shaken fingers. Across the camp, Odysseus drank quietly with Diomedes. "You knew he would do it," Diomedes said, voice low. Odysseus stared into the flames. What king among us would let a daughter stand between him and his legacy? The wind did not answer, but in the darkness, something shifted. The first leaf turned on the olive branch. A wolf howled far off in the hills, and a single ship creaked against its mooring, not from motion, but from anticipation. The gods had spoken. The first calling had begun. In the quiet heart of Mycenae, where laurel bushes framed stone courtyards and the scent of time drifted through open windows, young Iphigenia danced. She danced not for crowds or ceremony, but for the simple joy of movement. Her gown fluttered like sea foam in a summer breeze, and her laughter echoed through the garden like the tinkling of temple bells. Servants smiled as they passed, though none dared interrupt her rhythm. She was beloved, a daughter born not only of blood, but of light. When the letter came, Clytemnestra read it aloud beside the olive hearth. Her hands trembled slightly as she finished, though her voice remained poised. "The wedding is to be at Aulis," she said. "Achilles himself. Imagine that!" Iphigenia looked up from her embroidery, her dark eyes wide with surprise. "Achilles?" she repeated nearly in a whisper. The name sounded like a poem, one she had heard sung by minstrels in shaded halls. The warrior of prophecy, the man whose mother was sea foam and whose sword gleamed like the sun on water. "Yes," her mother smiled, though faint worry curled at the edge of her lips. "Your father insists. We must prepare." Within days, the procession set forth, a small retinue of guards and maids, horses decorated in pale silks, and Iphigenia seated in a chariot shaded with linen. The journey to Aulis was lined with wildflowers and warm dust. The sea never left their sight, sparkling like a mirror of the gods. Yet as they neared the bay, the atmosphere thickened. No festive banners flew, no musicians greeted them, and Achilles himself was nowhere to be seen. Clytemnestra stepped down first, her gaze scanning the camp with sharpened intuition. It did not feel like a wedding. It felt like waiting, like dread with polished armor. Agamemnon emerged from his command tent. He was dressed in simple robes, but his face was carved by sleeplessness. He did not immediately embrace his daughter, nor did he meet the eyes of his wife. Instead, he gestured toward a modest shelter they had prepared for Iphigenia, a veil over the truth, still fluttering in the wind. That night, while the camp settled into an easy silence, Odysseus sat beneath a fig tree beside the priest Calchas. "She doesn't know," Odysseus said quietly. Calchas shook his head. "She still dreams of garlands and bridal songs." The silence between them was heavy. "Is this truly what the gods require?" Odysseus asked. Calchas did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. "The gods speak in riddles, but the wind has not come, and until the gods are satisfied, this army rots on the shore." In her tent, Iphigenia hummed softly to herself as she braided her hair. She imagined Achilles waiting just beyond the dunes, perhaps watching the moon's reflection on the waves, thinking of her. She imagined what it might feel like to meet him, to walk beside him in myth and memory. Her mother entered quietly. Clytemnestra did not speak at first. She simply sat, smoothing the folds of Iphigenia's dress. Then finally, she asked, "Does your heart feel steady, child?" Iphigenia smiled. "I think it must be. How could it not? I'm to be married to a hero." Clytemnestra smiled back, though her eyes were clouded like stormy skies. The next morning, the ceremony was set. A makeshift altar had been arranged near the edge of the camp, where the sea breeze could almost be heard whispering against the canvas. A small crowd gathered, most of them unaware of the truth. They wore solemn faces, cloaked in formality. Iphigenia walked with grace. Her white gown shimmered like a morning cloud, and a crown of olive leaves adorned her brow. She looked not toward Achilles, for he was still not present, but toward her father, who waited beside the priest. Agamemnon's eyes did not shine. He took her hand, but his grip was neither firm nor warm. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to tell her, to stop it all, but the words caught in his throat. Then came the moment. Calchas raised his hands to the sky. The clouds above parted slightly, and before the blade could fall, a wind stirred, gentle at first, then stronger. A swirl of dust lifted from the earth. The banners snapped to life, and from the trees beyond the altar, a stag burst into view, white as snow, swift as silver, its eyes gleaming with divine fire. The crowd gasped. Calchas dropped the blade. "It is a sign," he whispered. "She is spared." Some said Artemis herself had sent the creature in place of the girl. Others swore that Iphigenia was taken, spirited away in a beam of light, hidden from the world in some sacred grove. But when the wind truly rose, and the ships pulled anchor with sails billowing full, Iphigenia was gone. Not dead, not buried, but changed forever in the minds of those who witnessed it. And though Agamemnon gave no public word, that night he stood at the sea's edge long after the torches had gone out. He listened to the waves as they curled like soft regrets, and his eyes searched the horizon for something he would never again hold. Behind him, the 1,000 ships of Greece waited, and in their hearts the warriors murmured, "Troy." The ships moved at last. Their sails, once limp and motionless under a punishing sun, now billowed with the breath of gods. They stretched wide like wings, catching the full push of the western wind. Across the endless blue, they carved their way, one by one, two by two, and soon in long, steady lines, like migrating birds returning to some half-remembered promise. From the cliffs of Euboea to the narrow straits of Chios, the fleet of Greece surged eastward. 1,000 ships, heavy with men, hope, and ancient grudges. On the decks, warriors sharpened their spears and checked their bronze greaves. But others, the younger ones especially, leaned over the rails and gazed at the open sea with awe. Never before had so many ships gathered for a single cause. The ocean itself seemed to part before them, as if it too had heard of Troy. At dusk, the sky turned to rose and honey, and the sea mirrored it in broken amber. In these hours, the war felt far away. On many of the decks, voices rose, not in shouts or commands, but in gentle songs, the kind sung to children in olive groves. Songs of home, of fig trees heavy with fruit, of sisters laughing beside drying amphorae. Odysseus often sat alone during these hours, his back against the mast, fingers absent-mindedly rolling a small carved token in his palm, a gift from Penelope, left behind on the shores of Ithaca. He watched the stars rise one by one, whispering their names like old friends. Though clever and calm, he too felt the strangeness of being part of something so vast it no longer seemed his own. Elsewhere on the lead ship, Achilles stood at the prow, arms folded across his chest, his gaze never leaving the eastern horizon. Beside him was Patroclus, his shadow, his mirror, the only one who knew how to quiet the storm in his soul. "Do you think they'll welcome us?" Patroclus asked softly, a wry smile on his lips. Achilles smirked. "If they do, they're fools." "And if they don't?" Achilles turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "Then they'll learn why poets need something to write about." Farther down the line, Nestor of Pylos, oldest among the kings, sat with his sons, telling stories of wars long past. He spoke of giants with stone clubs and sea serpents that once blocked harbors. Whether his tales were truth or legend, none interrupted him. In times of uncertainty, even the youngest warriors sought comfort in old voices. As the days passed, the sea remained kind. But the gods, ever watching, ever shifting, began to stir once more. On the 12th night, thick fog rolled in without warning. It crept across the waves like smoke, curling around mast and sail, stealing sound and sense. Men called out to neighboring ships, only to hear their voices swallowed whole. Then came the storm. The wind turned wild, not the friendly push of Artemis, but the chaotic howl of Poseidon's anger. Thunder cracked like split mountains. Rain struck like thrown stones. The fleet scattered, tossed like driftwood beneath the hand of a petulant god. Ajax the Lesser screamed into the wind, rallying his crew with iron resolve. Menelaus held tight to the helm, his beard soaked and streaming. Diomedes lashed himself to the mast, cursing each flash of lightning as if daring the heavens to strike him. But not all ships survived. Some were lost, swallowed whole, never to be seen again. Others washed ashore on strange islands, their hulls split and empty of men. Odysseus' ship barely held together. When dawn broke, he found himself adrift, separated from the main fleet, salt in his eyes and blood on his brow. Around him floated shattered planks and the shapes of men who would not return. He stared at the rising sun, and for a brief moment he did not think of Troy. He thought of Ithaca, of home, of the way Penelope's hand curled when she slept. But the wind returned, and so did purpose. By the time the surviving ships regrouped, they were fewer, but fiercer. The sea had tested them, and those who remained had proven they could stand beneath the weight of gods. When the shores of Troy first shimmered in the morning haze, it was not with triumph that the Greeks beheld it. It was with silence. There, beyond a field of golden grass, stood the walls of Ilium. Tall, strong, ancient, built, they said, by the gods themselves, Poseidon and Apollo working side by side in ages long past. Within those walls waited Hector, the prince warrior, Priam, the aged king, Paris, whose judgment had begun this fire, and Helen, once of Sparta, now of Troy. The ships lowered anchor. The men stepped ashore. Some kissed the sand. Others stared up at the walls and wondered how long it would take before they saw home again, if ever. And somewhere among them, the wind whispered through spear and sail. The war had truly begun. They came ashore like shadows before sunrise, men of Greece, quiet in the newness of arrival, uncertain yet resolved. The sands beneath their sandals were soft and golden, untouched by war, but already marked by fate. The sea was calm behind them now, as if hiding the storm it had thrown only days before. And ahead, the city of Troy rose from the plain like a crown upon the earth, its great walls glowing warm in the morning light. There was no sound but the distant call of seabirds and the faint rustling of tall grass. Agamemnon was the first to stand tall upon the dune. His eyes scanned the horizon with a commander's gaze, but his heart bore a weight that no armor could shield. He did not speak right away. He only raised his hand, signaling the others to follow, not with shouts, but with the quiet unity of a shared purpose. Menelaus stepped beside him, jaw set. His eyes were not on the walls of Troy, but on the idea of Helen, a name now woven into every heartbeat he had left. "This is where it begins," Menelaus said softly. Agamemnon nodded. "No," he replied. "It began long before this." They began to build. Not siege towers or catapults, not yet, but shelters, hearths, and trenches. The Greeks would not charge Troy with fire and sword in a day. This would be a war of years, of attrition, of patience. They were strangers on a foreign shore, and to survive, they needed a new kind of city, one made not of stone, but of will. Tents rose in neat rows. Fires flickered to life at dusk. Sentries walked slow circles through the grass. The ships were hauled up and arranged like a wooden wall behind the camp, their hulls pointing outward, a silent fleet watching the sea. On the third day, the Trojans rode down from the gates, not to parley, but to meet the strangers who had gathered like a storm. At their front rode Hector, tall, strong, wrapped in bronze and calm purpose. His spear shimmered in the light, but his face held no arrogance, only readiness. With him rode Paris, his brother, golden-haired and sharp-eyed. And behind them came captains, footmen, and watchers. The armies did not clash that day. They only looked. Two peoples, once distant, now divided by sand and story. And when they returned to their walls, the Trojans spoke not of fear, but of time, of how long the strangers would stay, of whether the war would come by fire or by hunger. In the Greek camp, Odysseus walked the perimeter with Diomedes. "They watch us," Diomedes murmured. "Of course," Odysseus replied. "They wonder who among us is Achilles." Diomedes laughed softly, "And we wonder the same." Achilles had not yet revealed himself in full. He remained with the Myrmidons near the shore, apart, like a storm cloud waiting to break. He trained alone, his spear dancing through the dusk like lightning. Only Patroclus stayed close, matching his steps, speaking little. "I thought we came for glory," Patroclus said one evening, watching the fires of Troy flicker on the hill. "We did," Achilles answered, "but they didn't say how long it would take." Each day passed with little blood, but much tension. Skirmishes flared at the edges, tests, not battles. And in the stillness of camp, the men told stories to keep fear away. They spoke of home, of olives and goats, and sisters who sang beneath fig trees. They polished their shields and carved shapes into the wood of their spear shafts, not symbols of war, but reminders: a bird, a wave, a woman's face. Then, on the seventh night, the gods stirred again. Above the plain, a star fell, long and bright, trailing fire. The next morning, Agamemnon summoned the leaders. "It is time," he said. "We test their gates." The Greeks readied their ranks. Bronze flashed in the morning sun. Shields lifted, spears leveled, banners rose with the wind. Achilles did not join them. He remained at the edge of camp, watching. "I will wait," he told Patroclus. "Let them see what they can do without me." The first true assault began with a shout, not from Agamemnon, but from Ajax, mighty and broad as a tower, who led the charge like a boulder rolling down the hill. The Trojans met them with fire and stone. The clash rang across the plains like thunder. For hours they fought, not to take the city, but to measure it, to press and feel its strength. And when the sun lowered, they pulled back, bruised but wiser. They had learned one thing that day: Troy would not fall easily. As night fell, the camp quieted again. Odysseus sat with his maps. Nestor wrapped an old wound in silence. Menelaus held a lock of golden hair beneath the stars and whispered her name to the wind: Helen. And on the walls of Troy, she stood in the shadows, watching them. Her eyes not cold, but distant. She held no sword, yet her presence carried the weight of every spear drawn in her name. Beneath the moonlight, two cities watched each other. The wind had brought them here. But it would be time, slow, grinding time, that would decide which name would live forever. The war did not end in a blaze of glory. It settled instead like dust, soft, slow, and everywhere. 1 year passed, then 2, then more. The ships of Greece no longer gleamed. Salt and time had dulled their paint, warped their timbers. The banners once bright with emblems of lions and eagles had frayed into threads, their symbols barely recognizable. The great wall of ships, once proud upon the beach, had become a crooked fence against wind and memory. The Greek camp, once a marvel of unity, had grown into a weary village. Footpaths ran between tents and lean-tos. Smoke curled from small fires that burned all day. Some men had begun to grow gardens in old amphorae. Others whittled small carvings from driftwood, birds, faces, tiny horses. War had become a rhythm. Wake, drill, guard duty, raid, rest, and repeat. The battles were no longer songs. They were skirmishes, brief and bloody, forgotten by nightfall. No one kept score. No one cared who won, only who survived. Odysseus often sat in silence by the sea, speaking to no one. His eyes, always calculating, now carried something softer. He wrote letters he could never send, folded them, and tucked them in a satchel made of goat hide. Sometimes he would take them out at night and read them aloud to the waves. Achilles no longer fought. Not since the quarrel. He had withdrawn his Myrmidons, the black-armored warriors of Thessaly, and refused to join the field. Agamemnon had taken Briseis, the girl gifted to Achilles in spoils, and the insult had cut deeper than any sword. Achilles had built his own camp by the sea, a half-day's walk from the main host. There he sat, like a lion pacing behind invisible bars. Patroclus was his only comfort, the only warmth left in the chill of waiting. "Will you never fight again?" Patroclus once asked quietly, beneath a sky full of cold stars. Achilles stared into the fire. "I fight when I choose," he said, "and I choose not to bleed for a king who does not know what it means to lose. But others bleed for you." Achilles did not reply. Within Troy, life continued. Strange and strained, but steady. The people grew used to the siege, just as they had once grown used to festivals, markets, the ringing of bells. The walls held. Behind them, Hector trained new warriors. He taught boys to wield shields like doors, to plant their feet like trees, to remember that courage is not noise, but resolve. Helen rarely left the towers. She watched the horizon as though trying to see past it. Some said she regretted. Others said she plotted. Few dared speak to her. But when she walked through the palace, her steps echoed like a song remembered from childhood. Paris still loved her, fiercely, even foolishly. But love, too, had faded into silence. He spent more time in the temple now, praying to Aphrodite with hands that trembled, wondering whether beauty alone was ever enough to build a home. Even the gods had grown quiet. After the storm and the sacrifice, they seemed to retreat, watching, perhaps, but no longer speaking. The mortals no longer prayed with certainty. They left their offerings. Yes, wine, oil, little loaves shaped like doves. But they did so with bowed heads and uncertain hearts, like children knocking on a locked door. There were moments of light, when a Greek patrol returned safely from a raid, when a Trojan child was born beneath the stars, when laughter rose unexpectedly over dinner fires, and someone recited a story from long ago. These moments were small, but they mattered. In war, small joys became anchors. On one cool morning, a lone minstrel arrived from Thrace, carrying a lyre older than the war itself. He played not of battle, but of seasons, of lovers turned into trees, of rivers that sang to the moon. Both camps heard him, and for a night no one fought. In the Greek camp, Diomedes sat beside the minstrel, his head tilted. "Strange," he murmured, "how a song can make even spears feel like feathers." The minstrel smiled, but said nothing. Elsewhere, Achilles listened from afar. He sat on a boulder, watching the moonlight turn the waves silver. Patroclus joined him, silent for a while, then asked, "What do you think of the song?" Achilles answered, "It made me forget." "Forget what?" "That we were ever meant to die." The minstrel left before dawn. By the next day, a skirmish broke out near the river. A dozen fell. The dust rose again. But something had changed. An almost imperceptible shift, as if the silence had begun to bend. Some say it began when Hector rode out alone, not to challenge, but to speak. He stood between the armies, helm off, spear grounded in the soil. He asked for a single combat. One man against one man. A contest not of hatred, but of ending. Agamemnon refused. But the silence had already cracked. The rejection of Hector's challenge echoed further than any trumpet could have. It settled into the hearts of both armies, not as anger, but as a slow, aching sigh. The duel that might have shortened the war had been cast aside, and yet the very idea of it lingered in the minds of weary soldiers like a candlelight flickering at the edge of darkness. One on one, man to man, not endless years of trench and trap. Agamemnon had refused not out of fear, but of pride. He did not want Hector's strength tested in a match the Greeks might lose. The war, he insisted, was not about single warriors, but the will of all Hellas. To allow Hector such honor would diminish the Greek cause, but many disagreed, silently. Odysseus, ever the thinker, walked alone that evening through the ridgelines above the beach, tracing the stars with his fingers as if to map a way out of fate itself. He said nothing to Agamemnon. He rarely did anymore. Quiet rebellion had become his art. Meanwhile, in Troy, Hector returned through the gates like a man who had spoken to ghosts. He said no words. He removed his armor slowly, reverently, as if he were undressing not a warrior, but a shrine. And when he looked upon his infant son that night, cradled in the arms of Andromache, he whispered, "I wanted him to grow up without this." Helen watched from a balcony. She had heard the call for single combat. She had hoped, no, prayed, it might succeed. But prayers had grown thin in Troy, and the gods remained silent, their statues gathering dust even in the cleanest temples. She spent her nights now tending gardens of herbs and lavender, seeking peace in things that still grew. Paris rarely joined her anymore. His gaze remained fixed on the battlements, on the threat that never left the horizon. He came to her once, in the coolness before dawn, and touched her hand. "I would fight him, if it would end this," he said. She did not reply. She had long ceased asking who him might be. Hector? Achilles? Agamemnon? Herself? Instead, she traced the outline of his palm and said softly, "What we begin is not always what we control." In the Greek camp, tension grew. The men were restless, their spirits caged. Even the games they used to pass time, wrestling, foot races, dice, had begun to sour with frustration. Then came the chariot race, an event meant to honor the fallen of the past year. A tradition rooted in old Mycenaean ritual, celebration through remembrance. Odysseus organized it quietly, hoping to bring some rhythm back to the hearts of men. The field was marked. The chariots lined up. Among the competitors, Diomedes, bold and beloved, Eumelus of Phyrae, swift and proud, and to everyone's surprise, Antilochus, son of old Nestor, still young, reckless with joy. The race began like thunder breaking open the sky. Hooves tore across the dusty plain. Wheels churned sand into wind. The crowd roared, Greeks and even some Trojan spies watching from afar, because for a moment this was not war. This was life, motion, beauty. Antilochus cut a corner too close and nearly overturned his cart. Diomedes surged ahead, cloak whipping behind him like a comet. Eumelus' horses flew like they carried wings. It was close. It was thrilling. And in the end, it was Antilochus, by a breath, who crossed first. They crowned him with laurel. Men laughed again that day. They drank honeyed wine and sang old sailor songs. Someone played a pipe fashioned from reeds. For hours, war faded like a shadow cast backward. But then the night fell. And in its silence, Patroclus crept to the edge of Achilles' camp. He had watched the race from a distance. He had seen the sparks return to men's eyes. And he wanted more than anyone to light that spark in Achilles again. He found him sharpening his spear beneath the stars, surrounded by stillness. "You should have raced," Patroclus said. Achilles did not look up. "I am not here to race." Patroclus sat beside him. "Then why are you here?" The wind tugged at their cloaks. "I came for glory," Achilles said after a long pause. "But now all I feel is waiting." Patroclus turned to him, voice soft. "Then change it. Fight." Achilles finally met his gaze. "You still believe it matters?" "Yes," Patroclus whispered, "because the war still believes in you." Far away, Hector stood alone upon Troy's outer wall, watching torches flicker in the Greek camp. He could feel the turning beneath the surface, like the shifting of tide before it crashes ashore. He knew. The silence would not last much longer. The nights had grown longer, their winds colder. Campfires burned low as supplies thinned and the stars pressed closer. The silence that once held the armies like a spell had begun to splinter. And in its cracks, fate crept quietly, bearing the scent of iron and smoke. In Achilles' camp, the flame danced in a slow, golden rhythm. Patroclus sat near it, wrapping worn leather straps around his wrist. The silence between him and Achilles had become a familiar thing. Not hostile, but heavy, like unspoken memory. Achilles stood a little distance away, sharpening his sword again, not from need, but from habit. Then Patroclus spoke, and it was the kind of voice that trembled despite strength. "Let me wear your armor." The whetstone froze in Achilles' hand. He turned slowly, eyes narrowed, not in anger, but disbelief. "My armor?" he repeated. Patroclus nodded. "Let them see the Myrmidon black. Let them believe you ride again. It will lift them. It may turn the tide." Achilles stepped closer. "And you would ride in my name." "I would ride to protect them." A silence thicker than war stretched between them. "You could die," Achilles said. Patroclus met his gaze. "And we are not already dying. Every day, we wait and do nothing. Something in us withers." Achilles' jaw tensed. "You are not me." "I know," Patroclus whispered, "but let me remind them what you once were." Achilles said nothing for a long while. Then he turned, walked toward his tent, and returned holding his armor. Bronze, polished to a dark shine, the plumed helm like fire frozen. He laid it before Patroclus. "Then be me," he said softly, "but come back." Patroclus smiled, though his hands shook as he lifted the breastplate. "Only if the gods will it." The next morning, the Greeks awoke to a tremor not of earth, but of hope. For there, riding at the front of the Myrmidons, was a figure they had longed to see. Bronze-armored, black-plumed, sunlit like legend. Achilles had returned, or so they believed. The Myrmidons charged with fury in their throats. They crashed upon the Trojans like a tide unmoored, driving back lines that had grown confident in the absence of the great warrior. The name Achilles rang across the plains like thunder wrapped in gold. From within Troy, Hector heard the call and gripped his spear tighter. The tide was shifting again. Meanwhile, Patroclus fought with the fury of borrowed flame. His sword moved like song. His shield rang with purpose. He did not kill out of rage, but out of protection. For each man behind him, for each day lost to endless waiting. The Trojans faltered, confused and afraid. And then, perhaps too deep in the thrill of forward motion, Patroclus went further than he should have. He passed the boundary of wisdom. He neared the gates of Troy itself. There, Apollo watched from the shadows of the walls, and the god, loyal still to Hector and the city, struck. Not with lightning or fire, but with a whisper of force, a push unseen, a stumble made sacred. Patroclus fell to one knee, and Hector was there. He did not know the man before him was not Achilles. But even if he had, it would not have changed what came next. He struck. The spear-pierced armor not meant for Patroclus's chest. And the man who had tried to carry glory for another fell into the dust, whispering a name, Achilles. The Trojans cheered. They believed the great warrior had fallen. But Achilles knew before the word reached him. He felt it, deep, bone-heavy, soul-raw. A silence louder than war filled his lungs. When the truth arrived, it did not surprise him. It only burned. They brought back the armor, now dented and stained, and with it, the body of his dearest friend. Patroclus, who had laughed beside him beneath countless stars. Patroclus, who had carried him through storms of doubt. Patroclus, who had been his better half in every way. Achilles did not weep. He stood still beside the body and whispered something to the wind that no one else heard. Then he turned and walked into the sea. Some say he called to his mother, Thetis, daughter of Nereus, goddess of the deep. And she came. She rose from the waves with hair of silver foam and eyes that knew the future. She touched her son's face and promised him new armor, forged by Hephaestus himself, the god of fire. It would gleam brighter than any star. It would sing when struck. It would bear the weight of vengeance. Achilles looked into his mother's gaze and said, I will not eat. I will not sleep. I will not speak. Not until Hector lies in the dust beside him. The tide had turned, and the silence was over. The morning after Patroclus's death broke quietly, as if the sky itself dared not breathe too loudly. The sand along the Greek camp was undisturbed, the sea unusually still, as though the gods, too, paused in silence. But in the tent of Achilles, silence was a thing now shattered. There, beneath the light of dawn, stood the armor of the gods. Forged by Hephaestus in a single night, the bronze shone with impossible beauty. Every plate, every edge, every line pulsed with divine fire. Upon the breastplate danced images of the world itself, of harvest and hunt, of battle and peace, of man's joy and sorrow, all interwoven into one breathing whole. And Achilles, wrapped in a cloak of grief and silence, stared at it. He did not touch food. He did not speak to the men gathered outside. He only whispered a farewell to Patroclus, laying a hand gently upon his still chest, and then turned to the armor. One by one, he donned each piece: the breastplate, the greaves, the golden belt, the plumed helm that caught the wind like a banner of vengeance. When he emerged from the tent, those who saw him said it was not a man that stepped onto the sand, but a flame. The Myrmidons fell in behind him, silent and grim. The Greeks, too, watched in awe, not cheering, not crying, only following. Across the field, the Trojans saw the figure moving toward them and felt the air change. Birds ceased their flight. Horses stamped nervously. The very sky seemed to dim, as if in reverence. Achilles raised no flag. He gave no speech. He simply walked toward the battlefield. The earth hushed beneath each footfall. The first man to face him did not live long enough to raise a shield. Neither did the second. What followed was not a battle. It was a storm. Achilles fought not with wrath alone, but with elegance. His spear danced like music. His shield moved like wind. And for every blow he struck, it was not just a man who fell, but an echo of his sorrow unleashed upon the world. Men fled before him. Even those who once mocked the absence of the great warrior now turned, afraid not just of death, but of something more, judgment. Hector stood upon the wall and watched. He had known this day would come. He had known since the moment his spear struck the heart of the man in golden armor. And Patroclus had whispered another name, Achilles. Now, as the fields burned with motion and Troy's warriors broke like waves against a cliff, Hector descended the stairs of the gate. He called his men to part. He stepped alone into the dust and shadow. "I will face him," he said. The wind curled through his cloak. The gates closed behind him. Across the plain, Achilles turned, his eyes already locked upon the figure walking slowly toward him. Hector held no shield of divine making. His armor bore the dents of 10 years. But in his eyes was no fear, only the heavy dignity of one who had done all he could. They met at the center of the field, surrounded by the broken breath of thousands. There was no need for words. All had already been said in silence. They circled once, then twice. Then the clash came. Spear against spear, sword against shield, the thunder of gods reborn. The earth itself seemed to flinch. Hector fought with the strength of homeland, of family, of duty. But Achilles fought with something else, with loss that carved deeper than any blade. And it was that edge which made the difference. Achilles' strike was clean. It pierced Hector's armor and brought him to his knees. As Hector fell, he did not plead. He only asked, "Let my body be returned to Troy. Let my son see me buried." Achilles stood over him, breathing like a forge. His hand tightened around the spear. But in that moment, something ancient stirred. Perhaps it was Patroclus' voice. Perhaps it was Thetis' whisper. Perhaps it was the gods themselves. Achilles did not answer with cruelty. He looked upon Hector, warrior to warrior, and finally said, "I will give you back to them. Not for your sake, but for mine." And with that, he lowered his spear. The Greeks took Hector's body with care. And though Achilles had promised no peace, he did not strike again that day. Instead, he returned to the camp, his steps heavier than before. That night, the fires burned low. And the war, for a brief and fleeting time, paused to mourn the noblest of enemies. The war, which had roared like a tempest for nearly a decade, now whispered. After Hector's death, a strange quiet fell over the land. It wasn't peace, not truly, merely an exhale between storms. Troy had lost its strongest shield. And though its walls still stood tall and proud, the song of its spirit grew softer, like a fading echo at dusk. In the palace atop the hill, King Priam, aged by sorrow more than time, sat beside the body of his fallen son. His hands, once strong, now trembled as he traced the lines of Hector's face. Lines carved by duty, by loyalty, by love. "I raised a lion," Priam whispered, "and now the lion sleeps forever." The women of Troy wept. Andromache, Hector's widow, held their child close, eyes hollow with grief. Cassandra, the cursed prophetess, wandered the halls, her cries of warning long ignored, her visions now turning darker still. But beyond the walls, in the olive groves and shadowed dunes, where the Greeks lingered like a breath drawn in, something stirred. The Greeks had not broken Troy, not with force, not with siege. And it was Odysseus, the wily king of Ithaca, whose mind turned like a river under moonlight, who spoke softly to Agamemnon, to Menelaus, to the grim-hearted Achilles. We cannot climb their walls, we cannot starve them out, but perhaps, he said, we can make them open the gates themselves. The idea was as strange as it was beautiful. A gift, a horse, massive and hollow, carved from timbers of ships long wrecked. It would be a tribute, a token of surrender. The Greeks would pretend to retreat, leaving this strange monument behind. Inside, however, soldiers would hide, Odysseus among them, brave Menelaus, silent Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, and others chosen for both courage and cunning. And so, beneath the cloak of night and the groan of secrecy, the horse was built. Its belly was wide, its flanks were smooth, its head stretched high, almost noble. The firelight reflected off its polished wood like stars caught in amber. When it was finished, the Greeks burned their tents and made show of sailing away, though only a short distance, hiding just beyond the curve of the sea. At dawn, the people of Troy emerged, cautious and confused. And there it stood, the horse, massive, mysterious, silent. The people gathered, murmuring with equal parts wonder and suspicion. "It's a gift," said some. "They've given up." "They've fled," others argued. "We've won." But Laocoon, the priest of Poseidon, strode forward, eyes wide with fury. He struck the flank of the horse with his spear and shouted, "Beware, Greeks bearing gifts!" The wood rang hollow, and the crowd fell silent. But fate has its own tide. As Laocoon turned to warn again, a cry shattered the hush. From the sea, two serpents emerged, great coils of muscle and hatred, sent, they said, by the gods. They wrapped around Laocoon and his sons, crushing breath and bone alike. The people screamed, and Cassandra wept, not because she had not seen it coming, but because she had, and once more, no one believed her. To the Trojans, it was a sign. The gods were angry with those who mistrusted the gift. So they pulled the horse through the gates. Inside the city, beneath bright banners and the rising hum of celebration, the horse stood like a monument to glory. That night, Troy lit lanterns and poured wine. Children danced in the courtyards. Musicians played old songs, their strings humming with wearied hope. Even Priam smiled, tired but smiling. High above, stars blinked softly, and below, inside the belly of the horse, warriors held their breath. The last ember had begun to flicker. Night fell like a soft blanket over Troy, warm and calm, scented with lavender and roasted grain. The city breathed in slow rhythms. From the rooftops came gentle laughter, the clink of clay cups, and the hum of lullabies echoing through the stone alleys. Inside the towering walls, the people of Troy allowed themselves a rare luxury: rest. After 10 long years of war, of siege and blood and fear, the Greeks were gone, or so it seemed. The massive horse, now resting in the central square, loomed as a trophy, its shadow stretching across the torchlit stones like a memory not yet named. Children touched it with wonder. Elders circled it with reverence. Some whispered it was sacred. Others said it was a doorway to peace. Only a few kept silent, not out of trust, but out of instinct. Among them was Cassandra. She wandered the city in her bare feet, robes trailing like smoke. Her eyes were glassy, haunted by visions no one could see. She touched each stone wall as she passed, whispering to them, as if they might believe her where people could not. "They are inside," she murmured, "inside the belly, like wolves inside a lullaby." But no one listened. The revelry softened with the night. One by one, the city's lanterns blinked out. Mothers pulled blankets over their children. Soldiers stacked their weapons for the first time without fear. The wind coiled gently between pillars, brushing across sleeping brows. Above it all, the horse stood still, and inside, breath was held. Odysseus crouched low, counting heartbeats. His fingers brushed the hilt of his dagger, not for attack, but for comfort. Across from him, Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, pressed his forehead to the wood, eyes closed in a silent prayer to a father he barely remembered. The others waited, 10, 20, more, each one a flame smothered in wood. Outside, the city grew quieter, until even Cassandra's footsteps faded. Then, in the deep hour before dawn, when dreams are their heaviest and the soul lies most unguarded, a faint creak echoed from the horse's flank. A panel shifted, almost imperceptibly. Then another, and a figure slipped out like breath from a sleeping mouth. Odysseus landed silently upon the stone. He crouched low, eyes scanning the square. There were no sentries, no alarms, no dogs barking, only stillness. Behind him, others began to follow. One by one, they poured from the belly of the beast, feet soft on polished stone. Each man carried fire in his eyes and silence in his limbs. They moved like smoke, spreading through the sleeping city toward the gates, the towers, the watchhouses. Near the great southern gate, Sinon, the Greek left behind to play the role of castaway, emerged from hiding and waved in the dark. A lit torch. From the sea, the Greek fleet saw the flicker. Like ghosts, their ships turned and began to glide back toward the shore. Back in the city, the gates were being unbarred. And still, Troy slept. Only Cassandra, curled beside a temple pillar, stirred in her dreamless doze, her brow furrowing as if the very earth had whispered something dreadful to her. The first scream came minutes later, sharp, sudden, shattered. Then the bells began to ring, though no one had rung them. Fire climbed the temple roofs. Iron sang on stone. And the peace that had blanketed the city turned to ash in the wind. The fire spread quickly, far too quickly for those just waking from the warmth of dreams. At first, it was just smoke, curling through alleyways like a trickster's grin. But then came the flames, red and gold and merciless, licking up the sides of homes, temples, and towers. The sky turned a deep, unnatural orange, as if the sun had shattered and bled into the heavens. Troy had no time to scream. Men leapt from beds and ran barefoot into chaos. Mothers shielded children beneath tables. Priests dropped their scrolls and fumbled for extinguished lamps. Soldiers grabbed swords still sheathed in dust and disbelief. But the Greeks were already there. They moved like shadows, swift and silent, then roaring and unstoppable. Odysseus struck first at the watchtowers, his dagger precise as moonlight. Neoptolemus, wild with his father's legacy, fought with a fury that left walls cracked and doors broken. There was no trumpet of war, no formal challenge, just fire and steel, screams and sorrow. Priam, the old king, stood barefoot on the steps of his palace, wrapped in a robe of white. Around him, the marble pillars cracked from the heat. The golden lions that flanked his throne now reflected only flames. "I have lived too long," he murmured, not in fear, but in a voice full of centuries. Long enough to see glory, long enough to see ruin. Behind him, Polites, one of his last sons, dashed down the corridor, pursued by Neoptolemus. The boy had not even time to shout before the Greek warrior struck him down, on the floor, at the feet of the king. Neoptolemus, blood-splattered, stared up at Priam, and Priam, aged beyond measure, stared back. May your father weep for you, Priam said, calm as the grave. And then Neoptolemus raised his sword. In the temples, the statues of gods flickered with shadow. Cassandra, still untouched by blade or fire, stood before the altar of Apollo, her face blank, her eyes dry. She had seen it all before, in dreams, in visions, in the way leaves fell from trees too early. A hand grasped her shoulder. Ajax the Lesser, the proud and violent warrior, sneered as he dragged her from the steps. But the gods, though slow to act, do not always sleep. That night, legends say, a storm rose from the sea, not of rain, but of fate. The heavens stirred, and the crimes committed in the firelight would carry curses into the bloodlines of those who committed them. Troy was no longer fighting a war. Troy was being remembered. Elsewhere in the city, the last defenders gathered at the temples and gates. Aeneas, a prince of Troy, cradled his father on his back and held his young son's hand, whispering prayers to gods whose shrines were now in ashes. He would not die here, not because he was a coward, but because the ember of Troy needed a carrier. And as he led a handful of survivors into the night, through alleys lit by ruin, a new story was being born, one that would sail far beyond the smoke. Back at the palace, the horse still stood in the square, empty now, its belly spent, its purpose fulfilled. It did not smile. It did not grieve. But if Wood could remember, it would remember the cries of that night forever. By morning, Troy was no longer a city. It was a name. By the time the sun rose over the Aegean, Troy was silent. Smoke curled like faded dreams from the tops of charred walls. Statues stood broken in half-light, faces chipped by heat and grief. The sea wind whispered through the streets, carrying the scent of ash and olives, dust and divine wrath. The city that once glittered with gold and hymns now lay in ruins, its voice extinguished, its crown shattered. But among the ruin, a few embers still glowed. Aeneas, weary and blood-streaked, moved quietly through the trees beyond the city's edge. His aged father, Anchises, clung to his back, silent but alive. At his side walked Ascanius, his young son, who still carried the wide eyes of childhood, now filled with questions no one dared answer. Behind them followed a handful of survivors, women with veils torn by fire, men limping, children clinging to silence like a blanket. They did not look back. Troy was not behind them anymore. It was within them now. Aeneas paused at a ridge, turned toward the dark plume still rising into the morning sky, and closed his eyes. "This is not the end," he said, to no one and everyone. "The gods have burned the city, but not the story." In time, that story would sail with them across the waters. It would pass from mouth to ear, from campfire to cradle, until one day it would rise again, not in stone or sword, but in legacy. Odysseus, too, returned to the shore, his armor dented, his thoughts already distant. He did not stay to celebrate. He did not chant with the victors. There was no victory in what they had done, only silence. Even Menelaus, who had come to reclaim Helen, found no joy in reunion. He looked upon her, not with anger, not with joy, but with a gaze that had wandered too far from its starting point. And Helen, beautiful still, stood like a painting fading at the edges. She did not weep. She did not speak. Because what words remain when fire has already spoken everything? From the ashes, the gods watched. Zeus, silent on his throne of thunder. Hera, veiled in storms. Athena, her armor tarnished by mortal folly. Apollo, whose temples had cracked beneath the weight of belief. And Aphrodite, whose promise had started it all. gazed not at the ruins, but at the faces that remained. She, perhaps more than any, understood that love does not always save. Sometimes it simply lingers. Years would pass. Troy would remain, no longer a city, but a myth. Aeneas would sail to distant lands. His descendants would build new empires. Odysseus would drift for a decade more, seeking home. Cassandra's visions would echo long after her voice was gone. And the wooden horse, once burned, once forgotten, would live on in story after story, as both a trick and a lesson. But on that final morning, with the air heavy and still, a single dove landed on a scorched stone near where the palace had once stood. It carried a piece of olive branch, and in the hush that followed ruin, a whisper floated through the air, not of war, but of rest. And now, as the last ember fades and the wind carries away the ashes of Troy, we reach the end of tonight's story. This was not just a tale of war and fire. It was a journey through love, pride, fate, and the quiet courage of those who endure. From the whispered promises of the gods to the footsteps of Aeneas leading survivors into the unknown, this story reminds us that even in destruction, there is always the seed of something new. Every name you heard tonight, Helen, Hector, Achilles, Cassandra, Odysseus, and so many more, still echoes through history, not because they won or lost, but because they were remembered. And now, through your listening heart, they live again, softly, gently, like a lullaby passed down through the stars. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way through this long, dreamy retelling of the Trojan War. If you enjoyed this journey and would like to hear more peaceful myths and fairy tales, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps this little storytelling corner grow. But most of all, I hope this story has brought you comfort, and I hope that tonight you drift off into a deep and peaceful sleep, filled with soft dreams and calm skies. Until next time, good night.